Welcome. I'm Jane Nicoll Stover, Archivist for the Park Forest Historical Society. The video we present today begins with Gregory Randall, author of America's Original GI Town, a thoroughly researched history of park forest planning, which became a textbook on city planning. It has been responsible for a resurgence of interest in park forest place in mid-20th century suburbia. Because Greg used and credited so many images from our collection, it brought attention to the archive from national museums, other authors, and textbook publishers. Here, Greg gives a much condensed account he put together for this program. The Society sells GI Town, and copies are held at the library. Next are excerpts from O Park Forest, A Work in Progress, a video produced in 1980 to 81 by Mel Muchnick and others to document O Park Forest, Oral History of Park Forest, Illinois, an award-winning project by the Park Forest Public Library. The Society now owns the oral history audio recordings and transcripts, and some on video. Then you will hear a brief history of integration in Park Forest, and finally, you will hear from residents who grew up in Park Forest. I hope you enjoy the program.
I would like to thank Jane Stover and the Park Forest Historical Society for this opportunity to open this celebration of the village's 75th anniversary of its founding in 1949. I've been asked to make a few remarks about those who created this unique community within the context of American city planning and the village's place within the history of America's urban growth since 1900. The Great Depression and World War II generated cultural revolutions that forever changed America. The economic collapse cut housing production by 90% in 8 short years. In 1933, foreclosures on private homes reached 1,000 a week. The failures within the banking industry left little capital available to private builders, and retail builders were being squeezed out of the market. And World War II now changed everything. After the war, Washington planners believed veterans and war workers would return to their hometowns. The Washington planners were wrong. Veterans stayed where their wartime jobs were. Others moved to the big city, and many ex-GIs remained near their wartime bases, especially on the coasts. Why go back to Oklahoma when you've tasted Los Angeles? America's challenge was housing millions of returning veterans and their young families. Housing built during World War II was cheap and supported the war effort. It was marginal and temporary, generally located near war plants, and seldom where most people wanted to live. The war's end brought great expectations, and a new home was one of them. Over 6 million personnel were released from service at the end of the war, and another 4 million followed in 1946. 98% of American cities supported significant housing shortages, and when combined with 90% who reported apartment shortages, it was apparent that trouble may be brewing. To counter this, the most critical piece of housing legislation was the passage of the GI Bill in June 1944. Among its features was its guarantee of a mortgage loan to veterans to purchase, build, or improve existing housing. The nation felt it was time to make up for the sacrifices of the past 16 years. Workers demanded jobs, increased wages, and lower prices. Industries across the country were being struck that summer. At one point, over 1 million workers were on picket lines, and yet these impacts could not alter the country's direction. It was also a time of change to the traditional family in America. A rootlessness had infected the country. People fled the farms and the ethnic urban neighborhoods they had known growing up. The United States was expanding into the countrysides and the suburbs. As William H. White noted in his 1956 book, The Organization Man, which featured Park Forest, in suburbia, Organization Man is trying, quite consciously, to develop a new kind of roots to replace what he left behind. To find solutions, President Truman turned to the private builders. In June 1945, he called a meeting at the White House. One of the people attending was an old friend of Truman's and the commissioner of the Federal Public Housing Authority, Philip Klutznick. With America's need for roads and expanding infrastructure, the private automobile would shape the American future. The demand for housing was unlimited. Yet, with all this post-war demand, Chicago had torn down more housing than it had built during the previous 10 years. The region was desperate for housing. Chicago builders began to explore the counties just outside the city limits. The properties along existing rail lines and near train stations became more important than before the war. To the few builders who had the foresight to look to southern Cook County, their success was realized far beyond their expectations. Park Forest, Illinois, is one of the earliest and best planned post-war new towns that were started during the post-war social revolution. Park Forest was created by 3 men who would meet this change. Each was from a different place and one from a different time. The crossroads of time, opportunity, and politics brought them together. Philip Klutznick was born in 1906 in Kansas City, Missouri. His family immigrated to the United States after the Russian Kishinev pogrom of 1905. His father, Morris Klutznick, opened a shoe store in Kansas City just before Philip was born. His entrepreneurial spirit was passed on to his oldest son. After finishing his studies at Creighton University, Klutznick practiced law in Omaha, Nebraska. His reputation grew as a housing expert, and in 1941, he was offered a position that brought him to Chicago as regional coordinator for the Federal Office of Defense Housing to manage temporary housing for defense workers and their families. Eventually, Klutznick's various federal positions required extensive contact with home builders and their associations across the United States. His 20-year friendship with President Truman would redefine Klutznick's opportunities. After 3 heady Washington years, Klutznick saw that his Federal Public Housing Authority Commissioner position would change. Peace created unlimited opportunities. If there was one element of Klutznick's personality that would never alter, it was his ability to see an opportunity and seize it. Carol Fuller Sweet Sr. in the spring of 1945 was living in Chicago and, like those born in the last century, had seen the world forever changed. Now, 68 years old, this war was about to end, and with it, he watched the birth of a bold and different world. Sweet was the eldest of 5 children born in Grand Rapids and graduated from Yale University in 1899. He had been a banker and a business president, and like many others, had been in and out of work during the Great Depression. As Sweet's life moved into the difficult times of the 1930s, he became deeply involved in the New Deal politics of the Roosevelt administration. Soon he headed to Chicago to look for a job that would appeal to his aspirations. That job was with the regional office in the National Housing Administration, Philip Klutznick's agency. At the start of World War II, he was a regional allocator of critical materials, especially those needed by the home building industry. Sweet dreamed of a new town, a city of trees and parks, a place for people and returning GIs. Can't anything be done to give these veterans something approximating the kind of living on a scale they could afford? He said. Gradually, Sweet evolved a scheme for a GI town with the spaciousness and greenery of a park and affordability for all. During the war, Chicago developer Nathan Manilow asked Carol Sweet to join his home building firm. After the strains of his NHA job proved too much for the elderly Sweet, he was ready to accept Manilow's offer. Nathan Manilow was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1898. Pragmatic and a risk-taker, Manilow made real estate deals when few opportunities were open to Jews. His ability to focus on the deal compensated for his lack of formal education. He built apartment houses and commercial structures in Chicago. Soon, Manilow realized he was on the wrong side of the borrowing business. Shifting to the lender side earned him significant profits, which he reinvested with other builders and to the future. Manilow knew solving Chicago's housing problems would be difficult and expensive. He looked for opportunities and was sure that post-war growth would happen in the suburbs. Philip Klutznick met Carol Sweet while Sweet worked for the National Housing Association in Chicago. They developed a friendship, and soon Sweet introduced Manilow to Klutznick. Their casual and professional relationship hardly foretold the future when the three men would form the organization that built Park Forest, American Community Builders. The community that Klutznick described for Sweet and Manilow would not be another tract development. This village would be a new idea of urban planning based on concepts from earlier in the century. Greenbelt communities that shared many of the same planners, visionaries, and theorists who traced their lineage back to 1869 and Riverside, Illinois. Those earlier towns, Greenbelt, Maryland, Green Hills, Ohio, Greendale, Wisconsin, and Greenbrook, New Jersey, were authorized in 1935 and were an experiment in urban planning unlike anything done in America. 8 miles southwest of Milwaukee, the construction of the third Greenbelt community, Greendale, began in 1936. Here, planners Jacob Crane and noted landscape architect Albert Peets created the smallest and yet considered by many the best of the Greenbelt communities. Peets' merging of the detached house concept with the cul-de-sac set Greendale apart from the other Greenbelt towns and was fundamental to Park Forest's early designs. Philip Klutznick hired Albert Peets to plan Park Forest with the architects Lobel and Schlossman of Chicago. Klutznick also required the most significant change from post-war planning. Park Forest would be incorporated and the residents would control their futures, something the government did not grant to the residents of the Greenbelt towns. It is hard to imagine how difficult Park Forest was to build. Nonetheless, it had many firsts. It was one of the few new towns to succeed based on the Garden City concepts, and it was the last of the Garden Cities. It developed mass construction systems not unlike Henry Ford used to build automobiles. It was one of the first communities to build a central shopping plaza to serve the residents. It planned to connect directly to the regional transit system, the Illinois Central. It broke new ground on FHA guarantees for private capital investment. And it was at the forefront of cultural and social change, as noted in the book, The Organization Man. And more importantly, the elected village founders mobilized and challenged long-held beliefs in racial housing, and it would deal with changes to the regional urban fabric that tore other communities apart. And it is still one of the best and most affordable places to live on the south side of Chicago. I wish the village and all the residents the best future possible, and thank you.
The developer we were working with was a corporate entity with great strength, financial, political strength. Yeah. And we were a group of volunteer elected people of very limited experience and very even more limited resources, financial resources, right. and political. And so that we had the public behind us, we had the voters behind us, but the question was, there were many times that we were not exactly equal, despite the fact that we were 10 or 20,000 to 1.
I feel I came with the muck and the mud, and unless you saw pictures of Park Forest in early days, I don't think you could believe what it was, with mud and wheeling baby buggies on duck boards. And I think we were really privileged to have grown up here. Really do. I think we all learned a lot. We learned to live with other people more than you would ever have learned to live in the city. You learn to live with all religious groups and all nationalities, and I really think our children learned respect for other people.
All right, now, in between these buildings is a big grassy mall, presumably for what purpose? What's
That
supposed
was
to
the
go
front
on?
yard. That was it. We saw it as people playing in there, and I think that we had plenty of land. We had plenty of land, and they let us use it. And look how much nicer it is between there and there. You know.
Why are there no
Of course,
streets?
they're this way, but here you see you've got a wall that separates you. But here you've got all this nature.
Well, why aren't there any streets going through here? This is a gigantic, in fact, it's called a super block, isn't it?
Oh, but the whole thing here is this is fixed so these kids can go any place around in this big block, and they won't get hit by anything.
So there's no streets to
roads.
cross.
There's no road. There's just these little things where you come in at the ends.
So it's like living in a park.
It's living in a park forest.
13 million Americans were overseas or in the army. We had built no housing except temporary housing, except a few Title VI houses comparatively. It was clear that we were going to face a smashing housing demand. And when the president decided he wanted to bring them all back at once, which he did, right after we settled affairs in Japan, bringing that many people back, married people who had not seen their wives or their husbands, inevitably after years of recession and years of war, was going to leave a very high pent-up housing demand. There was no place to go. There was just no place to go. People would come to this town, the Organization Man, if you've read it, people who were on the way up, and they had one child, two children. They didn't want to go out to Park Forest. But there was no place where they could rent a place or buy a place that was within their income. And we had such an extraordinary demand that we were able to select people who came with good backgrounds, who had children, who were in desperate need.
How did you select them?
Well, look, how did we select them? How do you select anything? We had a staff, a leasing staff. The applications would come in, and they would select them on the basis of the criteria. Was the family right size? Was the income adequate to pay the rent? Did they have any past record of being malcontents or whatnot? When you're selecting between people, you select the best people you can. And in the early stages, this was very easy because the demand was so great that you could select. And we selected, as you have already said, people with college degrees and people who were seeking college degrees and people who were on their way up. The number of people that I run into all over the world that lived in Park Forest, the first question they ask me is not, how did you enjoy being a martinet? Quite the contrary. The first thing they say to me, you don't know how much we appreciated what we had there.
We're standing here and there's trees and there's cicadas in the trees and every place is painted and obviously lived in. What was it like though when you came here? When was it, 1948?
1948.
How did it appear then?
Well, this was a buggy whip. These were all buggy whips. There were no trees, really. They
Grass?
were just planting. Are you talking now about at the very beginning?
Right, when you moved here.
No, this was not yet sodded or grassed in. However, believe it or not, there were sidewalks. This court had sidewalks from the very beginning.
And most of them did not.
Most of them did not. The ones across the street were the ones with the duck boards, and some of the other courts south of here didn't have sidewalks.
Duck boards look like pallets, don't they? And you have to sort of balance as you walk up.
No, they were just wooden, open work lattice kind of boards to keep you out of the mud, because I'm telling you, kids would get out here and play, and then Mama would come out, and if it had been raining,
she would pick the kid up and the boots would stay in the mud.
Well, now,
And she'd have to go out and fish the boots in.
why would a young married couple and small children want to move to a development where it wasn't sodded, where the trees were, as you say, little saplings? What's the attraction?
Well, you're gonna get me involved in a long thing when you ask me a question like that, because you've got to remember that veterans came back from World War II. Everywhere they went, they ran into such stuff as, we don't want children, point one. Point two, if you want to rent an apartment, you have to pay 3 months security deposit in advance. And if it was a sublease, a guy would have a battered kitchen table and a battered chair, and he'd say, yeah, I'll sublease this apartment to you, but you've got to buy the furniture. The furniture will cost you $2,500. They didn't have it. Rents were exorbitant. So when Park Forest, and I didn't believe what I was hearing, when Park Forest first was announced and under construction, the much maligned, subsequently ACB said, we have priorities. First choice of apartments will go to veterans with children. Second choice of apartments will go to veterans. Third to non-veterans with children. Fourth to whoever, if there's any left. This was an end unit. This was a very desirable apartment.
And this is the one you moved into?
That's the one I moved into, and it was $85 a month. Now the center units were $83 a month because they didn't have the extra exposure. In addition to which, ACB asked for 1 month's security deposit. So all of us who came out of the Army were broke. Salaries weren't what they are today. We could afford it. They were bright, they were clean, they were new.
Hardwood floors, that kind of thing?
Hardwood floors and plastered walls, and it was, compared to what you could see in the entire Chicago area, this was by far and away the best buy that anyone could get.
We moved on to Elm Street, and we had duck boards for walks, and we had concrete blocks that were not fastened in yet to the back porch for stairs, to get up the porches. We had very wet basements and no stores at all. When we moved into the court, I'm trying to remember, there were 8, and 8 is 16, and 5 is about 21. There must have been close to 30 families in our court. And everybody moved in the same day or within a couple days. And everyone had common problems. And everyone came from a different location. And you got to be friendly with your neighbors in the court, or you didn't have anybody else to be friendly with, because you didn't wander away from where you lived. There were no sidewalks to get from one court to the other.
Not only did we start with no ordinances, no police department, no public works department, we had no money. So finally we built up a police department when we started getting our sales tax money and our real estate taxes. Because of the lag of a year and a half, it took us a while to get these funds in. And we built a village government from the bottom up. Started with nothing and built these various departments. We used to have meetings that used to go till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And I think in the first 2 years we must have passed about 200 ordinances, all the basic ordinances. And we sometimes had 3 and 4 meetings a week just to take care of the appropriate business. I would say that went on for at least a year and a half.
In 1957, we had a bond issue, and this was a little piece that we put together at the time, and there was 2 secrets for it. First of all, we combined this with a library referendum at the time, and it was also what we called the $10 rule. You didn't want to provide any tax increase that exceeded $10. So if you can see, this was carefully guaranteed to be $9.92. And what this proposal was to build a library, do some work in the parks, to build a recreation building, and it was the first attempt at a golf course.
A pretty ambitious referendum.
It was, and
All of the ones except the golf course succeeded very satisfactorily. So then we got into the problem of starting to build this, and we had been fortunate that even before we went to the public with this, we did have a park planner in here. His name was Art Hodes from McFadden and Everly, and we had good counsel from him, and he developed the basic plan to these parks, which is being carried out today. Now, there have been variations from it as time has gone on, but he instructed us about when you're doing it, try and be able to maintain it with equipment. In other words, they had these people who came in and they wanted to have a formal garden. This is in Williamsburg.
It was an atmosphere of the recovery of a society. We were in the middle of it. I want to be remembered in Park Forest for only one thing, and that is as a man who headed a company that undertook an assignment and that produced what they undertook to produce, with all of the errors of human nature that play into it, some of them due to the failures of the organization itself, which is never perfect, many of them due to the expectations of a period of change, which it was after the war, many of them the ingratitudes of people, and many of them the sheer importance of preserving for each person who had anything to do with it an important place in history. And sometimes that's done better by criticism than it is by approval. The fact that Park Forest is the only post-war product that won 2 All-American awards certainly is a tribute to the people who lived there. But there wouldn't have been any Park Forest, and there wouldn't have been any award for Rich High School if people didn't work together with the developer and the developer with them to produce it. And the spirit of controversy and debate, which is the essence of a free society, never had better expressions than in Park Forest. And those expressions were by people whom you haven't remembered at all in the discussion, who honestly had just complaints of their own. And we developed forums where they could have those complaints aired. And it was a great experience in my life. I'm delighted that I lived it, and if people think it was a failure, let them enjoy it. From my point of view, as one who still has a bit of an expert, a reputation as expert in this area, I think it was the only post-war community created from the beginning in which the people who lived there had something to say about their own destiny, and in which the developer had to pay a price for that privilege. And the two together made a better community because of it.
Harry Tashima was a mensch, a super mensch actually. A good guy, really good guy, stand-up guy. He had trouble getting into Park Forest himself. He was a Japanese American, and the builders didn't sell to Japanese Americans, but they would sell a piece of property. And so he bought a piece of property and built his own home. He was a structural engineer. This was in 1954. In 1954, discrimination was something that was pervasive across the whole country. The notion that people had a right to live where they wanted to was just not current. What was current was people had the right to refuse to sell to anybody that they didn't want to, and they didn't want to sell to people who were of a different color. The reason that they didn't, in part, was because the real estate community said that was the way it ought to be. The lending community, the mortgage community, said that's how it was supposed to be. And the government, the national government, said segregation is our policy. So in Park Forest, segregation prevailed. From 1947, when the town was first opened to the public, until 1959. And fair housing didn't come to the country until 1968, and then there was no enforcement of the law. Harry Tashima was interested in living in a racially integrated community. He had gotten together with people at the Unitarian Church Social Action Committee and studied it for some time. They came up with ideas, pledge cards, that people wouldn't discriminate. They brought out speakers, they educated themselves, but that wasn't getting anything to happen. His position was that if I need to have integration, I need to do integration. And he, together with the Wheelers and Jim Saul and a few other people, decided that they would recruit potential black buyers, ready, willing, and able black buyers, and recruit white sellers, ready, willing, and able to do business with a black buyer. They worked with the NAACP, with the Urban League. They contacted the Chicago Defender, the black paper. A couple of years went by and they had no success. Finally, they did have success. They found a man by the name of Dr. Charles Wilson. He and his wife were interested in moving into Park Forest. And he was willing to work in order to make it come to pass. Harry Tashima was looking for somebody who would sell. And it turned out that a Mr. Growall, who was a member of the Park Forest Human Relations Commission, was having trouble selling his house when he had to transfer to another location, and decided that he would be that person. Now, he didn't tell the Human Relations Commission. As a matter of fact, he didn't tell his wife. And she was rather surprised when she found out that the house had been sold to a black family. But the black family moved in on Christmas Eve of 1959. So affirmative action to replace ghettos was something that Harry Tashima was willing to work on in a very personal way. Replace white ghettos, replace black ghettos, replace any kind of one race living situation with integrated and balanced living patterns. And this effort then ran into a problem. Other people didn't follow. So the Wilsons wound up transferring elsewhere in the country following a job. And there was a time when segregation prevailed, except for Asians and perhaps some Hispanics. The situation didn't change until 1963. And in 1963, the tenor of the times had changed. Martin Luther King, on the 28th of August of that year, presented his I Have a Dream speech. The civil rights community had changed people's minds, and suddenly there were people who were willing to risk feelings, risk a sense of security in order to move into an area where their race was grossly underrepresented. And in Park Forest, where the government hadn't taken any affirmative action in order to change the situation, there was a confirmed interest in maintaining the safety and security of people, regardless of their color, and therefore working in what some people might consider a passive way, but in a very stable governmental fashion to make sure that this was not going to bring disrepute upon the community, upon the village and its residents. And this brings me to 1964 and to Myrtle Alice Colston.
Hi, I'm Myrtle Martin. I moved to Park Forest in 1964, and that was right at the beginning of the time when they had started having the townhouses become cooperatives. I had moved to Park Forest because I had a job in Kankakee and I needed housing, and I was single, so I wanted a 1-bedroom. But when I came to the rental office and asked for a 1-bedroom apartment, I was told that they did not rent to Negroes, but that I could go to the cooperatives and get a 2-bedroom townhouse for the same price as their 1-bedroom. So that's exactly what I did. My application was accepted, and I was given an opportunity to pick a townhouse from a map that I was shown. I want to remind you that at that time, the only Negroes that had purchased houses in Park Forest had purchased foreclosed houses. And I think about 8 families had moved into the houses in 1963. In 1964, most of the Negroes that moved into Park Forest moved into cooperatives. And they were scattered throughout the area of the cooperative housing. The Human Relations Commission and the village had come up with a plan to protect us as we moved in. So when I moved in, the chief of police, Hamby, visited my house and assured me that I would be protected and that a plainclothes person would be walking the block for a while to make sure that I was okay. I found out much later that a committee of the village had gone into my cooperative court and talked to all the residents there. They held a meeting and they were told about me, what kind of job I had, where I was coming from. And I found out much later that the purpose of that was to not only tell them about me, but to assess the attitude of the people that would be my neighbors. So I found out later also that the one woman that had lived next door to me moved right away, and a woman on the other side decided she was not going to be my friend, but she would be civil. But there was another couple, I think, in the court that sounded like they might cause trouble, and that was probably the reason that Chief Hamby had the plainclothes person walk the block for a while. I had no problems. In fact, they had a reception for me and welcomed me into that co-op. I have read letters that we collected from Black people that moved in when we did the 50th anniversary, and they talked about how the police sometimes would be parked across the street when they moved in. And they asked the police if there was a problem, and they said no, they were parked there because they wanted to make sure there would be no problem. So the police were very active, and that committee was very active in making sure that although the village was not inviting Negroes to move in, but if they did move in, they would be protected. And they also told the community, whenever there was a rumor of trouble, they were confronted and told that it would not be tolerated. So the fact that the village had made plans to ensure that integration would work is the reason that it did work.
transition from white segregation to black segregation became the challenge. And getting the real estate community to avoid clustering all the blacks moving into a little circumscribed area and then having a white ghetto and a black ghetto, or having the whole community resegregate. So real estate practices had to be adjusted. And in the 60s, it was a matter of negotiation. It was not a matter of being able to pass a law and make it come into existence, because the federal government had backed away in the wake of the disturbances following Martin Luther King's assassination. They backed away from the notion that they were there to take affirmative action to replace ghettos with integrated and balanced living patterns. Therefore, park forests had to continue to have a very conscious approach. Integration had to be maintained just the way a house needs to be maintained, a car needs to be maintained, health needs to be maintained, income needs to be maintained. So the conscious effort had to be made. And that was something that Harry Tashima found out before the local government got it into its head that it needed to do that. And it needed to do that on a continuing basis, because the federal policy has never actually turned into what it was intended to, the replacement of ghettos with integrated and balanced living patterns. Park Forest was able to handle that, in my opinion, because it was used to engineering the community. It was a planned community. They planned various other aspects of the community, so they accepted conscious planning of racial integration. And other communities that don't have that kind of background wound up struggling a bit more. There are other ways to overcome it, but it's important to say what Harry Tashima taught the government, and that the government worked on and allowed the time of racial integration to be extended over many years.